That's going to depend on how things go when we close out the books at the end of the year. If everything goes smooth, we'll be ready by the third Sunday. If everything's a little bit more complicated, we'll have it around the fourth Sunday. So I think everything's going to be fine. We do have a pretty good system in place now, and everything seems to be updated on a regular basis, and so we're in pretty good shape. Christmas Eve service will be December 24th. That's going to be our regular AM service at 10:30. There will not be an evening service on Christmas Eve. There also will not be any Sunday school. We have a lot of people participating in that morning that need to be in here early, so rather than trying to plug holes here and there, we just decided it would be best just to have the service at 10:30. So that will include the kids. We're excited about that. The kids will be up here leading the first worship song, and they'll be in costume. They'll stay up on the platform during the worship portion of service, the singing portion, and then after that they will go back to join with their parents. The nursery will be open, but children's worship will not. Most of the kids will be in here participating in the service. And at the end, we'll finish with a traditional candle lighting service. And the amazing thing about this building is it doesn't matter if it's daylight outside or not, because guess what we don't have in the sanctuary? Windows. As far as we will be able to tell, it'll be completely dark in here on Sunday morning when we get down to the end of the service. So we'll be able to do our candle lighting service, and that will all be on Sunday, December 24th. And again, don't forget to invite someone to come with you. Also, don't forget that if you want to take donations off on your taxes, that money has to be given by the end of the day on the 31st. So that's New Year's Eve, so don't forget to give it in the morning service on December 31st so it goes into the count that evening. No Kids for Truth on the 20th and 27th. Tonight is going to be their last one until after the first of the year. A lot of people are going to be gone, so we're finding that out. We're going to be filling a lot of holes starting on Christmas Eve. We've got a lot of people traveling and different things, and that's the way it works in today's world. People's families are spread out, and people on holidays in particular try to go see family, and it's sometimes family comes here, sometimes the family here goes there, so it's always a challenge. So that's the reason for that. New Year's Eve, we're going to have communion this year on New Year's Eve, and we're going to do it during the morning service. So New Year's Eve will be our communion service to end the year. We will not do it on Christmas Eve. I think with all the things we had going on with the kids and everything, it's just a little too much. And so we'll do communion, and probably going to basically build the whole service around communion on the 31st. So I haven't quite decided that for certain, but I'm leaning that direction. And there will be no PM services on New Year's Eve. And that has been a long-standing tradition for me. I typically do not have services on New Year's Eve. If people want to have gatherings on their own, that is perfectly fine. I've been to a few as well. But the New Year's Eve to me is a time that I don't like to be on the roads. I'll just be quite honest. I really don't. I mean, I've had friends that have gotten into bad accidents on New Year's Eve. Some of that was their fault. Sometimes it was someone else's fault. And I just don't like to be out myself. I'll just be honest about it, because people are crazy. And people should not, and I'll say this and I always say it, don't drink and drive. I mean, it's just not a good thing. So, and then, like I said, we'll start up the regular schedule after that. So, usually New Year's Eve does not fall on a Sunday, so it doesn't affect that. But I have never been one to have New Year's Eve services at churches. That's a big part of the reason why. Don't really want to put people at risk to be out, and a lot of people just choose to stay home that evening anyway. So, that's all the announcements. So today we're going to dive into Jeremiah chapter 7. We're going to be starting out in verse 30. And we're going to try to finish up the end of chapter 7. I think we can make it. Well, I probably have plenty of time. Might even get done a little early. But we want to continue and look at what God is revealing to Jeremiah. So we have also, and it's always interesting that I didn't know this at first. I think you don't even think about it when you're reading through the Bible for your first time, or maybe even your second time through. And then later on, I realized that Jeremiah and Ezekiel are working at the same time. Have you ever noticed that? that they are contemporaries. So Jeremiah was not the only prophet who was being rejected. Ezekiel was as well. Ezekiel probably started his judgmental, for lack of a better term, prophecies before Jeremiah did even. He saw, because Ezekiel was shown by God, that a lot of things that would really become apparent after Josiah's death were still going on in secret. And so we're going to look at a couple of verses, actually several verses in Ezekiel in just a moment, because they really add context to what Jeremiah is preaching and teaching in chapter 7. So in chapter 7, verse 30 of Jeremiah, it says, "For the sons of Judah have done that which is evil in my sight, declares the Lord." And again, we see this constant refrain where God is referring to their actions, the things that they have been doing. And he's referring to those actions as evil, sinful, abominations. We see different words, but they're all negative words. They're all talking about the actions of the Hebrew people in a very negative fashion. And coming from a holy God, that means that those actions are clearly sinful and unrighteous. It says they have set, and then he gets into a little more specific. So we see often that as sort of like a title or a heading, and then God will give us details, and he'll give us some new revelation about something they've been up to. So here's what he says in this particular message. "They have set their detestable things in the house which is called by my name to defile it." This really reveals their depravity and the absurdity of idolatry. They have actually taken their idols and placed them where? In the temple. When he says, "in the house which is called by my name," he's referring to the temple in Jerusalem. So at some point, and this is probably right after the death of Josiah, and I got a feeling there were some idols in the temple before Josiah started his Reformation work. They had put their little statues in the temple of God. Now it's debated in what part of the temple they put them. Some people claim that it was probably just limited to the outer courtyard area. The place, by the way, that Jesus referred to as the place of prayer, and the place from which he drove the money changers when he wrapped those cords together and basically whipped them right on out of that area. Others believe it was actually probably images, for they say, "The Lord does not see us, the Lord has forsaken the land." And so they thought they could get away with it because God did not know what they were doing. "And he said to me, yet you will see still greater abominations which they are committing. Then he brought me to the entrance of the gate of the Lord's house, which was towards the north." So it appears that in this vision, it's not really in a particular moment of time. This is a vision of events at different moments in time. So the dark room is almost certainly something that happened while Josiah was alive. The events that follow would be events that are occurring in the time period after Josiah's death, because they would not have been brazen enough to do this while Josiah was alive. "Then he brought me to the entrance of the gate of the Lord's house, which was towards the north, and behold, women were sitting there weeping for Tammuz." And nobody's quite sure what that means. Best guess is Tammuz was one of the Canaanite idols, one of the Canaanite gods, and they were weeping for that god. That was a common practice of the pagan people, is that they would weep for their gods, because their gods were not all powerful. Their gods were strong in a physical sense, but they were very weak in a mental sense. So all these gods they worshipped were modeled after themselves, and these idols were weak, and so they would often weep for them, to connect with them, to show sorrow over the suffering of the gods, because their gods suffered because they were weak. And their gods were constantly at war with one another, much like Greek and Roman mythology. Their gods were modeled after themselves, and they basically carried the human traits of frailty, weakness, sin, ignorance, foolishness, and so they would weep often for their gods, and that's probably what's going on here. He said to me, "Do you see this, son of man?" You will see still greater abominations than these. Then he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house. And behold, at the entrance to the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men with their backs to the temple of the Lord and their faces toward the east. And they were prostrating themselves eastward toward the sun. So they were also, on top of worshiping a multitude of idols, they were also worshiping the sun. In fact, we know that some of the Israeli kings, the Jewish kings, they would actually race to the hilltops in their chariots to see the sunrise so that they could pay homage to the sun god and thank him for the rising of the sun that morning. And that was pretty common in pagan religion, was worship of the sun. They just, in different ways, believed that the sun, he was either a god or they worshiped the one who made the sun rise, which in a sense is God Almighty, but they did not worship God Almighty. It was something far different. And so you see again this issue of sun worship, idol worship, all these different forms of worship. But notice how it's being done in the temple area. So they're in the courtyard, and they have their backs to the temple, and they're basically kneeling or prostrating themselves, facing towards the rising sun. Then he said to me, and continuing on in Ezekiel to verse 17, he said to me, "Do you see this, son of man? Is it too light a thing for the house of Judah to commit the abominations which they have committed here, that they have filled the land with violence and provoked me repeatedly? For behold, they are putting the twig to their nose. Therefore, I indeed will deal in wrath. My eye will have no pity, nor will I spare. And though they cry in my ears with a loud voice, yet I will not listen to them." So that's going to end our reading in Ezekiel. The last part's kind of funny. The idea of putting the twig to your nose. And there are two possible meanings, but they both involve the same act. So that is not just a figure of speech. It came to be sort of an idiom, but it's actually rooted in a physical activity that we know a lot more about today than we did even 5 or 10 years ago because of research and findings in the Middle East. So the people who worshiped idols in the Middle East in those days, the Canaanite people groups that surrounded Israel after they took over the Promised Land, they would actually take a small branch off of a tree, and they would usually try to get one with leaves on it still, and they would hold it to their nose. And it was then used as some sort, and we don't know a lot of the details, but it was used as a pagan worship ritual. So they did chant certain things when they did that, and it was generally associated with the worship of the sun. And we see that not just in that part of the world, but we also see that type of activity here in the Americas, especially South America, such as the Aztecs, the Incas, and the Mayans. You also see that in some of the older Indian tribes of the United States area, in this particular region. In fact, there was one that settled in Ohio. How many of you have ever heard of the Serpentine Wall in Ohio? Wow, nobody's heard of this. You guys have never been to the Serpentine Wall? Oh my goodness, it's amazing. There is a snake shape in Ohio that was built when Native Americans, it's funny how you use, I gotta be careful how you use that term. We're not sure how native they were. We're not even sure where these people came from, but they basically, it sounds like they came from somewhere around where Israel was. They basically put dirt into a mound. It's very well constructed. It's very large. And it's very pronounced. You can't miss it. It's in a very flat area. And it basically is the shape of a curved snake. And the head points directly between two very large hills that basically when the sun rises, it shines right down the middle of the head of the snake. It's really cool. I've been there a couple times. I'd like to go back and take pictures. I'd love to go back and put a drone up in the air. They're really trying to hinder that because of the work of Graham Hancock, and everybody wants to do it because everybody wants to get aerial photos of the shape and the direction of the snake. But they were very intentional in this, and it was centered around the worship of the sun. So this act of doing this was usually done, from what we can tell, again, this is not agreed on by everyone, but I think it does fit. They would take these branches at certain times of the year which I think later became the solstices, and they would hold them to the end of their nose, and then they would chant some sort of probably praise to their particular sun god, their version of the sun god. So it also fits very well in what Ezekiel is being shown, this worship of the sun that's actually taking place in the temple of God, and there's every chance that they were doing this with putting the twigs to their nose right in the temple itself. But this is also then an extreme insult to God, because his house is being used to worship the sun. And this is also something they could just do from their own villages and their own towns, off the rooftops of their homes. So it had basically its roots in idolatry, and now God's people are doing it. So that's what Ezekiel was bringing out. And they would have been aware of what it was, who was doing it, if they were themselves doing it, and what it meant. So Jeremiah chapter 7. So back to Jeremiah, verse 31. So that's a little insight into what Jeremiah is referring to, because Jeremiah doesn't go into the detail that Ezekiel does, but they are both being given these various messages by God to deliver as a warning to God's people. It's also God's way of saying, you're not hiding anything from me. You may think because you go into a darkened room and lock the doors and don't let anybody else in that nobody knows what you're doing, but I know what you're doing. It's a reminder to us that God knows everything that we do. That's a scary reminder, isn't it? Because not everything we do is holy. Jeremiah 7:31. So back to Jeremiah. They have built the high places of Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I did not command, and it did not come in to my mind. Let's read verse 32. Therefore, behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when it will no longer be called Topheth or the valley of the son of Hinnom, but the valley of the slaughter, for they will bury in Topheth, because there is no other place. So in this 2-verse section, Jeremiah is talking about a particular portion of Israel that's just to the south and east of Jerusalem. It's a very well-known place in their day. In fact, it was a very well-known place in Jesus' day as well. It was just outside of what we would probably call the area built up around the wall, sort of the suburbs of ancient times. And it was more out into the country, into the offset area. And it's in the middle of the valley. There was a raised up place in the middle of this valley, and that place was called Topheth. What happened there was that they built a high place to Baal there. And we know that because Jeremiah 32:35 tells us, let me get to it. They built the high places of Baal there in the valley of Ben Hinnom to cause their sons and their daughters to pass through the fire to Molech, which I had not commanded them, nor had it entered my mind that they should do this abomination to cause Judah to sin. So later on, Jeremiah was inspired to give us a little more detail on what was going on there. So what they had done was they had built basically a place of worship, a high place to Baal, and they had built an altar to Molech. So they were trying to appease all the various gods. Molech required child sacrifice. Most of the Baals did not, interestingly enough, and it kind of makes sense because they were also fertility gods. It doesn't make a lot of sense to give offerings to your fertility god and then offer up the most important part of fertility that he blesses you with. But Molech was a god who demanded human sacrifice, specifically infants. And so they had built a sacrificial area for Molech as well. So they built a place to worship Baal and to offer sacrifices to Molech, which again just shows how messed up they were. And they did this in the valley of Ben Hinnom in a place called Topheth. And Topheth was a raised area in that valley. And so what they would do then is they would bring their infants, and the way sacrifices to Molech worked as a general rule, and we can assume they followed the general practices of the Canaanite people, is that they would build an oven or a furnace, most likely more like an oven with an open top. And they would stoke a fire in there until it got extremely hot. And then Molech was generally a statue made of stone, probably very rudimentary, not really that well defined, but also then with some sort of like arm type shape or something along those lines. And the infants would be placed there, and then there was a lever, and the infant would drop into the fire. So that's just general how they did it. They also could just toss the kids in. I mean, it's really disturbing the practice practices that these people indulged in. And Israel followed right along with them, and they did the same thing themselves. And then, as God said, something that he never asked his people to do. He never wanted sacrifices of people, and he certainly did not want the sacrifice of their children. And so this was something that was just completely over the top, and it was part of the reason why God was going to destroy them. It was a big part of the reason why the Canaanite people were driven out of the promised land in the first place. So they built this place, a place to worship their various idols, specifically Baal and Molech, and they also then offered their children on this altar to Molech. And does anybody know what this place was called in the days of Jesus? It was still sometimes referred to as the Valley of Ben Hinnom, but that had been shortened quite a bit. For a long period of time, it is referred to as the Valley of Slaughter. And we'll get into that in just a moment as to how it got that designation. So for a long period of time, it went from being the Valley of Ben Hinnom to more of the Valley of Slaughter. That's the way they would remember it for generations. By the time Jesus is walking the earth physically, it has a different name. And they have shortened the name in Hebrew to Gehenna. Now let the gravity of that sink in for a moment. They had shortened the name to a place called Gehenna, and what they did in Gehenna was they had kept the stove or the oven area, and that's where they burnt the refuse. That's where they burnt their trash. The carcasses from sacrifices, the skins and the leftovers from dead animals, which they used the majority of, but there were things left that they didn't want that were unclean. They just burnt things there. So it was considered, Gehenna was considered the place that you took your refuse to be consumed by fire. So they basically incinerated their trash. It was for them, definitely, the most sanitary thing to do. Things that would, such as carcasses and things that would create disease and problems of that nature, they incinerated. And so they had a place outside of the city that they took all those things to incinerate them so that they did not sit around and fester and rot and create diseases. Now they had dumps. We know they had city dumps, but it was reserved more for products that disease would not grow in. So they kind of had an idea of things that made people sick. They weren't stupid, like a lot of your modern day historians imply that ancient people were stupid. They were not. They knew there were certain things they didn't want to leave laying around, and those are the things they took to Gehenna to destroy in the fires. And Jesus uses that. The obvious connection, right, is those things that are abominable wind up in Gehenna, a place of fire and destruction. So he used that as a reference to the coming judgment of God. Those things that are impure and unholy and unclean will be cast into a place similar to Gehenna, where they will be punished forever for their rebellion against God. So the valley, again, later became known as Gehenna in Greek. So that's in Greek as well. The interesting thing is there's so many play on words here, but Topheth itself seems to come from a conglomeration of Hebrew words that mean stove or oven. So again, this whole valley has carried this designation by the time Jesus is on earth for hundreds of years as being a place of fire, intense heat, a place where things that are unclean are taken and destroyed. So again, you would see why Jesus would use it. And it has a deep history for the Jewish people. Jeremiah 7:33. So now we get an understanding of why it would be called the Valley of Slaughter. So it goes from being the Valley of Ben Hinnom, which all Ben Hinnom means is the sons of Hinnom. So it was the valley of the descendants of a man named Hinnom. It went from being that to being the Valley of Slaughter. And here's where it gets that name. The dead bodies of this people will be food for the birds of the sky and for the beasts of the earth, and no one will frighten them away. So when the invading army descends upon Jerusalem, what did happen to them and what Jeremiah prophesied would happen to them were the same things. So basically, when the enemy descended upon them, they retreated into the only safe place they had, which was the city of Jerusalem. It was the fortress of Israel. And so all the people that could get in got in. They shut the doors. And they stayed inside. They didn't have the ability to go out and wage war on their own, so they fought from a defensive position. And eventually they were overwhelmed and they were slaughtered. And many of them tried to flee. And guess where they tried to flee to? But there was no escape. The enemy was coming from the north, so they tried to flee to the south and to the east because they didn't want to flee directly south because that would have put them in Egypt. And who did Josiah go out to wage war with? Egypt. So Egypt doesn't have a very warm place for the Jewish people. Never really did. And the invading army, they didn't have any love for the Jewish people. And so they fled to the only direction they thought they could find some way to escape, and that was to the south and the east, which took them right into the Valley of Slaughter. Not only that, but since that was a ready-made oven already, right? You see the irony in all this in God's judgment? They had made a large oven, a place they could stoke tremendous amounts of fires to offer sacrifices to Molech. All that's right there and ready, so when you slaughter a large number of people, you don't leave the bodies laying around, and they're not going to take the time to bury them in rocky terrain. They took them to the Valley of Slaughter to incinerate them. Now, as brutal as that sounds, the point is, it is a perfect fulfillment of what God prophesied through Jeremiah. And you see the significance then of Jesus using that valley as an illustration of the coming judgment against the entire world. So Gehenna carried powerful meaning to the people that Jesus was teaching. And this is kind of the backstory on where that powerful meaning comes from. So there's a reason he uses Gehenna as an illustration to explain the concept of hell. Now, what's interesting about this last verse, verse 33, is it actually is almost a direct word-for-word quote from the law of God in Deuteronomy chapter 28. Let me read a couple verses there. Deuteronomy 28:15, but it shall come about if you do not obey the Lord your God to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, with which I charge you today, that all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. Now, I'm not going to read all the curses, but there's a whole list of things. And Israel had already went through this all the way to the very end. Judah was about 95% of the way through this when Jeremiah is prophesying. So everything that takes place in those verses, all the way up to verses 25 and 26, had already taken place or was in the process of taking place. And this would then be the end for each, the northern and the southern kingdoms. Listen to what he says in verses 25 and 26. The Lord shall cause you to be defeated before your enemies. You will go out one way against them, but you will flee 7 ways before them. And you will be an example of terror to all the kingdoms of the earth. Your carcasses will be food to all birds of the sky and to the beasts of the earth, and there will be no one to frighten them away. Now, just for clarity's sake, I'll put them side by side. So there's Jeremiah 7:33, and there's Deuteronomy 28:26. Now, the wording is slightly different, but not much. It's actually almost identical. So the Jeremiah passage says, the dead bodies of this people will be food for the birds of the sky and for the beasts of the earth, and no one will frighten them away. Deuteronomy 28:26 says, your carcasses will be food to all birds of the sky and to the beasts of the earth, and there will be no one to frighten them away. See the similarities? All the way back when Moses was alive and God was giving the law to Moses, and before they entered the promised land, they were given this, and they had agreed that they were going to worship and serve God. They had been told very clearly that part of this covenant agreement was that if you refuse to worship and serve God, that after a period of time, if you will not listen to God's chastisement, if you will not pay attention to God's calls to repent, if you will not turn from your wicked ways and return back to God, then God will basically destroy you. And this is the way in which you will be destroyed. The big difference in wording is that Deuteronomy is worded as in this could happen, and Jeremiah says this is going to happen. This will happen. The could is not dependent upon God in Deuteronomy 28. The could is dependent upon the Hebrew people. And what he's telling us in Jeremiah 7, and the slight changes in wording, point in the direction of they have already crossed the line. There is no way back, and God has set in motion their destruction, and this will take place. And it will take place in the midst of the current generation. So when you see that, it really kind of brings it home that they should have known this was going to be their end all along. And then it is played out in, of all places, the valley of Ben Hinnom, which became the valley of slaughter, which then became Gehenna. And Jeremiah 7:34, then I will make to cease from the cities of Judah and from the streets of Jerusalem the voice of joy and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, for the land will become a ruin. So again, then wrapping that up, this particular message that God gave Jeremiah, he wraps it up then, I will make all of these things, all the things of joy and gladness to come to an end. All of Israel will suffer. Judah will cease to exist, at least in that moment. Those who do not die will be carried away into captivity, and it will be decades before any of them are allowed to return. So the land will actually be repossessed by the people of the surrounding nations. And that then is the conclusion of that portion of his prophecy. Now, there's a couple things before we close that I just find fascinating about the book of Jeremiah. Last week we made the point that when God gave Jeremiah his revelation about the temple, he sent Jeremiah to the temple to preach that message there. Now, you talk about some courage. I mean, Jeremiah's got some courage. I mean, and it's God-given, I'm sure, but I think it's also part of who he is as a person. And so he goes to the temple gate, and he preaches that message in the gate of the temple to all the people coming in and going out. Guess where he goes to preach this message? The Valley of Ben Hinnom. If you're going to preach a message like this, take it to the people who carry the guilt, right? The people who are actually going there and taking their children and offering their own children as sacrifices to Molech. So he's not just preaching this all over, and I believe he did preach it in more than one place, but the specific target of this message is the people who worship Molech. And not everybody in Israel worships Molech. Again, regional deities. So different areas worship different gods. Not everybody in Israel worshiped a God who demanded that they offer their children as sacrifices. But there are people who do. So guess who gets to hear this message first? Those people as they're going to do that very same deed. And so we see that Jeremiah is sent almost always to speak directly to the people that each individual message he gets affects the most. So when he starts to get these messages about the leadership later on, he doesn't just preach them in the street to everyone. He goes straight to the palace. He goes straight to the places of power, and he delivers those messages. So when he's dealing with the corruption in the temple, he preaches that message in the temple. When he's dealing with the abominations going on in Ben Hinnom, he goes right to Ben Hinnom and proclaims the message about the abominations going on in Ben Hinnom. God sent him to those locations, and he went to the people that he was dealing with, which, wow, it's awfully easy to talk about those things when you're talking to the choir. It's a whole other thing to talk about those things when you're right in the belly of the beast. It really is. But that's where God's power comes in, and that's where God was able to empower him and use him to proclaim these messages. And then what happens, the byproduct of that is that everyone who heard those messages, when the judgment comes, they know. Whether they like it or not, they want to acknowledge it or not, they know deep down inside that they deserve whatever punishment it is that they are receiving from the hand of God. So when the enemy rolls in and the walls are breached and they flee into the valley of slaughter, they're going to know this is not some foreign power. This is our God turning us over. This is not the hand of man ultimately. Ultimately, this is the hand of God, because they will have been very clear. They will have a very clear understanding of what their part in the destruction of Judah was. So whether it's the abominations in the temple, the abominations happening in the valley of Ben Hinnom, the abominations in the palaces, or the abominations in the streets, Jeremiah takes each individual message and delivers it to the targeted audience that God wants that message delivered to. So that just gives you an understanding of the difficulty of the life of Jeremiah. And the The king doesn't respond very well, the religious leaders don't respond very well, and the people don't respond very well. Nobody wants to hear what God says about what they're doing, even though in almost every message, if not every single message, he is clearly stating facts based on the Old Testament law that each one of them claimed to love and obey. But each message targeted, each message delivered. All right, that's it. We'll do prayer requests.